In this episode, we're going to talk about energy stores. Now, a system is an object or group of objects, and energy can be stored in a system in lots of different ways. Some stores of energies are, firstly, kinetic energy. So that is the energy stored by an object's movement. Secondly, we've got a gravitational potential store, and this is the energy stored in an object raised above the Earth's surface. And this energy exists because of the Earth's gravitational field. The third store of energy is a chemical store. So that's the energy stored by the chemical bonds between atoms. Fourthly, we've got elastic potential store, and that's the energy stored when an object is being stretched, compressed, or squashed. Next, we've got the nuclear store. So that's the energy stored in the nucleus of an atom. And the energy in the nuclear store can be released by radioactive decay. And lastly, we've got the internal store. Now, the internal store is the energy, or the internal store of energy is the sum of the kinetic energy stored in a particle or an particle of an object, and the potential energy stored in the chemical bonds between the particle's object. So I'll say it again. The internal store of energy is the sum of the kinetic energy stored in the particles of an object, and that's summed to the potential energy stored in the chemical bonds between particles in the object. So the seven main stores of energy are kinetic, gravitational potential, chemical, elastic potential, nuclear, internal, and thermal. Now, in terms of kinetic store, the energy in an object's kinetic store comes from the random motion of its particles. The body's temperature, the temperature of the body, which is just the object, is the measure of the energy in the kinetic store of its particles. So if you increase a body's temperature, that increases the energy in the kinetic stores in the body's particles, which means that the energy in the body's internal store has also increased. The energy of the object's potential store comes from the potential energy stored in the bonds between particles. And just to run through that, the internal store is the sum of the kinetic store and the potential store. So in terms of kinetic store, that's the energy from the motion of the particles, and the potential store is the energy from the potential energy stored in the bonds between particles. So to run through that one more time, the internal store is the sum of the kinetic store and the potential store. The kinetic store is the energy from the motion of the particles, and temperature affects the size of the kinetic particles. The size of the kinetic energy of the particles. So increasing the temperature transfers energy to the particles, and that increases the energy in that body's internal space. And internal store, And remember, when we talk about a body, that's just an object. And then thinking about potential store, the potential energy is the energy that's contained within the chemical bonds in a material. So the stores of energy, again, we've got elastic potential, we've got nuclear, we've got chemical, we've got internal, we've got kinetic, and we've got gravitational potential. So I'm going to run through them one more time. We've got kinetic, we've got elastic potential, we've got internal, we've got nuclear, we've got chemical, and we've got gravitational potential. And remember that heating an object increases the energy in the kinetic stores of an object's particles. So if something's cold, it has less kinetic energy. That's because the particles move slower when it's cold. And if it's warm, it's got more kinetic energy. and that's because the energy is transferred to the particles and they vibrate. So, can you remember those stores of kinetic energy again? See if you can run through them and get them before I can. We've got gravitational potential, got elastic potential, got nuclear, got internal, got chemical, and what are we missing? Kinetic. And can you remember what an object's internal store is? It's the sum of two things. Can you remember? Well, it's the sum of the kinetic store, and the sum of the potential store. So, in terms of the relationship between temperature and energy, lots of energy in the kinetic store causes a high temperature, and temperature increases the energy in the kinetic store. And also you need to remember that increasing a body's temperature increases the energy in its internal store. And can you remember those two components of an object's internal store again? Remember, we've got kinetic store and we've also got potential store.